Let me introduce Deirdre Bradley. She's going to speak with us today about the psychological aspects behind women adopting mobile technology for empowerment. Deirdre?
Well, thank you for joining me today. I've always been interested in women and technology. One of the things that interests me in particular, we know from different studies that women use technology differently, but there aren't a lot of examinations of why that is. And so I was trying to get at that within my study, at least look at some aspects of it. I've also worked in international development, and I wanted to combine the two. And in looking at developing countries, it's been quite clear that there's been a large gender gap in internet use. What's most significant is that in recent years, it's been closing quite quickly. And if you take a look here at the developed versus the developing world, you'll see that there is a lag of women behind men, maybe not as significant as it used to be. When you start to look at individual countries, there you can see quite a wide difference, with some of the most affected areas being sub-Saharan Africa, where there can be probably about a 50% gap in internet usage, women versus men. When we start to look at mobile broadband, you can see that there's quite an extensive growth globally. And what's amazing about the mobile broadband is that unlike the infrastructure of regular broadband, where it was very resource intensive, you needed a lot of money and a lot of upkeep, mobile has the capability of providing internet use without any of that heavy infrastructure. And so the growth of mobile broadband has been significantly faster than the physical wire broadband has been. You'll see from the color coding that we have some of the lowest penetrations, as I mentioned, in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, in Arab states, and in some of the Asia-Pacific region. When you start to look at the Americas, broadband use by men and women is basically the same. When we look at the percent difference in adopting ICT, the number is getting smaller, but we still see that women use it differently. I wanted to take a look at these factors that help to explain why there were differences. One of them, of course, is education. Another is the finances, whether they have access to money. Age is significant, and that's pretty significant across technology adoption in general. Then there are cultural barriers. Does the woman live in a culture where education is reserved for boys or for men? Or if there is a computer in the house, is that solely used by the men in the house? All of these can have an impact on whether women have access to the internet. Why is this important? Because mobile technology is the hot thing now in development. You'll start to see articles that talk about M-Women for mobile women, and the overall projects are called Mobile for Development with the number 4 in it. It's because of the great promise mobile technology has in bringing the internet to very remote parts of the world. My question was around that famous line out of the movie, if you build it, will they come? If we start to distribute phones and internet connectivity to women, can we just assume that they're immediately going to pick up and use it, create businesses and use all these applications that we're building for them? Or can we identify psychological barriers that may interfere with that adoption process? Some of the things that already have gone through as applications using mobile for development have been birth registration, so that midwives can actually record live births using mobile. And it's been found that when a child is registered at birth, it actually, first of all, it makes them an entity within the system, so they are entitled to all rights of citizenship. They can get government services, but they've also been able to link that it decreases the probability of these children winding up in slavery because they actually have an identity. There's another program by the World Bank around land registration. Often a family has been farming, but there's been no formal registry of that land to the family. Husbands often work in another area. Women are the agriculturalists. So if men are working in a mine or working in another city, the woman is left with the land. And if he doesn't come back, if something happens or he abandons the family, she's lost all rights to that land. Through the World Bank, they're now doing geopositioning of land and marking land boundaries using phones so women and their families can claim land rights. These are just some of the services that they've been able to invent around mobile registration. So it's a very exciting area, and that's really the reason reason why I wanted to study it in more depth. It will depend on their willingness to participate in these programs. What I decided to do was to use a classic behavioral research model called the reasoned action approach. And what that says is that intention to commit a behavior is the best predictor of the future behavior and not actually the reverse. What we look at is the constructs that go into forming intention to use. And in this case, it's an intention to use a particular type of technology, mobile. The four constructs that are used are attitude. What attitude does the person have towards the technology? Is it a positive predisposition or a negative? Their perceived norm, either how other people they perceive as being within their world and important to them view the technology, and also how those people would view that individual using the technology. For example, would your mother and father approve of your doing it? Do your best friends do it? Do your schoolmates do it? Do the women within your circle do it? Those would all fall under norm. And then behavioral control was a newer aspect that was added. Do they feel that they have the ability to actually use the technology? Not only the skills and the knowledge to do it, but physically, do they have it, or are they prevented from using it? And all of those will actually form the intention to use. There are two layers to this theory. They say the three constructs that go into forming the intention to enact the behavior. What are the underlying beliefs that then form that construct? So the behavioral beliefs form attitudes, social norm beliefs form the perceived norm, and of course control beliefs perceived behavioral control. My first hypothesis was around these three model constructs, and would they be significant in explaining intention? I believe that they would. And the second part was that I thought that the relative significance of each of these constructs would vary by culture. That's something that has not been examined that I could find, though it's been hinted at. Many studies looked at it and kind of conjectured that this would be important, but there weren't actual statistics I could find on people investigating this aspect. I wanted to go into a similar geographical region to pick countries that were culturally diverse. So I picked South Korea, Indonesia, and New Zealand. Part of the basis I used for selecting these countries was the work of Hofstadter, started in about 1980. He worked for IBM and did this cross-cultural study really to figure out how people from other countries could best work together by understanding cultural beliefs. He did this based on four constructs within a culture: the power distance, or the acceptance by the culture of inequality. Do you have, kind of a very rich, politically powerful class and a whole underclass? And how well does the country accept those strata? Individualism, the ability and the desire of someone to act as an individual as opposed to being part of a greater group. And if you think about the US, let's say, versus Japan, those would be two cultures at fairly opposite ends of an individualism spectrum. Masculinity is not referring to genders, but a culture in the sense of, does it admire quote-unquote masculine values of power, of taking charge, versus what they consider a more feminine culture where people come to discuss things, to weigh things in consideration more before acting. And then uncertainty avoidance really is risk avoidance. And how flexible is the culture around change? Here is an overall diagram of different groups that you'll see. In the US is basically in the independent, ambitious, choosing their own goals, varied life. In the upper left, Eastern Europe or the Islamic cultures, more of an emphasis on family security, on respect for tradition. And one of the interesting aspects here was that sometimes you'll find individual countries mapped, such as the US, because they are just pretty distinct from others. Japan, similarly. Then you can also get countries that map together. They're so similar when it comes to culture. And so Latin America is able to be grouped. Interesting case with the Islamic countries, because they can be geographically from all different parts of the world, but the religion is such an overriding cultural aspect that they tend to group together. For my statistical model, I used multiple regressions and other statistical means to look both at the constructs and whether they explained intention to use mobile apps and the beliefs that actually went into forming those constructs. So when I took a look at attitude, What the women from the 3 countries showed overwhelmingly is that they saw benefit to mobile technology, and they rejected statements like, I don't see this as having any advantages over things I can do already. They definitely saw there was usefulness. A lot of it had to do with efficiency, being able to accomplish tasks, and even the ability to earn more money, which is very interesting for mobile for development agencies, because part of the goal is for women to start businesses on their phones in rural areas. Women did perceive they have the ability to use these business apps, and that's been a mixed result in studies that have been conducted globally. There's been a lot of fear that women wouldn't know how to use it and would be afraid to use them. At least within the results of my study, I found that not to be the case. They were willing to embrace it. Now, the attitude beliefs that were important in forming that construct is, again, an emphasis on saving time and the ability to complete their task anywhere at any time. So efficiency and flexibility were important. When I took a look at perceived norm, they felt that people like them use the apps, the people whose opinions they value, they thought would approve of their using it, people important think I should use it. So not a negative backlash, even across the cultures. Although I will say that as we go and look at these constructs and the beliefs by country, you do see different results. But overall, this is the picture. And the norm beliefs that went into it, as you might guess, people like me are likely to use close to me and people whose opinions I value. And then when we looked at control, the ability to actually use the apps, the women responded they were confident they could do it, they had the resources they needed, and they felt that whether they chose to use the business apps was under their control, so no perceived barriers. The number one belief that was important to women was this first one, and it came up across all 3 countries, and it was the only one that was significant across all 3 countries: the ability to control their finances by themselves. This is something Mobile for Development projects would welcome hearing, because it's a very clear selling point, adoption point for women to use it, the fact that they can control their own money. And then, of course, other things you would expect. If the cost decreased, they'd use it more. Also that if their family objected, it would be more difficult for them to use it. But in the perceived norm, we found that they didn't perceive that their family would object. Our takeaway points from the study, I showed that the model could be used in predicting intention to use the mobile business apps, and these constructs did vary by culture. The one construct that was important across all 3 cultures, significant, was attitude. And that is in agreement with other studies that have used the reasoned action approach. It's most important to look at someone's attitude towards the technology and the beliefs that form attitude if you want to improve adoption. For the social norm, when we looked at beliefs, only the descriptive norm was important. When I asked them questions about whether people within their community, men and or women, would approve of it, it didn't show up as important, which is honestly something I didn't expect. I expected that the attitude of men towards their using the business applications would be important, but it turned out not to be significant, at least for this particular study. Only the descriptive norm of people like me using it was important. And so that tells a message also to development organizations that if you're going to pitch this as an adoption tool, you want to depict people similar to your target audience using it, and not so much the approval of parents or teachers or leaders within the community. Those facts did not resound with these participants. Only the fact that people like them would approve and were using it. In the significance of social norm, it was highest in Indonesia, followed by South Korea, and then New Zealand. And it parallels the concept that has been shown in other studies that social norm, it tends to be important when the technology is new to a culture, but then its importance diminishes over time. And that's what I was seeing across the 3 countries. The more exposed the culture was to the technology, the less important social norm was. Again, an important point for development agencies to realize. And as I mentioned before, with the perceived control, the most significant factor across was the ability to control finances. The thing that I found most intriguing was with the reasoned action approach to the model, you actually get a value that comes out. And the higher the number is, the more positive attitude towards performing the behavior, which was using mobile apps in this case. Indonesia was overwhelmingly more positive around the technology than either South Korea or New Zealand. And that was kind of interesting because South Korea is known as the globally #1 in mobile infrastructure and technology. I would have expected South Korean women to be more positive because so much of their life is tied to mobile applications within that country. And that didn't turn out to be the case. And New Zealand had the least positive attitude, which I did find somewhat surprising because I would have thought longer exposure in New Zealand and the New Zealand women had more access to phones. Wouldn't they have a better grasp about everything that the phone could do with them? But the more I thought about it, I've come to believe, and of course this is a belief and not something that I'm able to prove, is that for Indonesian women, the mobile phone represents more than a mobile phone. They see the potential of it being able to control their finances, to potentially start a business, and to do these kinds of projects with the phone that gives them a freedom they do not have in their own lives, right? That they can't necessarily go to a market and start a business, but on the phone they can do that. Whereas in a country like New Zealand, the mobile phone, it's a convenience and they can access the internet, but they can also access it at home and they can control their money on it, but they can also control their money at home through their own accounts, through their banks. The phone represents more of a convenience, but not access to a whole kind of world of features and activities they can do that they can't do otherwise in their day-to-day life. And so that's something I'd like to study more with a country like Indonesia, which is also quite fascinating. And the reason I did pick it is because culturally it's very conservative. It's a predominantly Islamic country, and studies have shown that women tend to lag behind technology adoption in Islamic countries. And yet here I had Indonesia that was the most positive about it and had the most women that had actually been using the applications. Very interesting, surprising result I would like to investigate further. The other important aspect for my follow-up studies is to take this into much more rural areas and see if the results hold, or if things like social norm or perceived control start to become more important for more remote and underserved populations. That is my study, and I'd welcome any questions.
Excellent, Deirdre. Thank you. Do we have some questions for her?
Yes, how does age factor into all of this?
It's a good question. Yeah, when I saw the results of the countries and the disposition towards the technology, I did run an analysis of age. The youngest group was Indonesia, although the South Korean women were just on average a little bit older. I put no age limit on the study. I found that on average the Indonesian women were in the range of, I believe it was 29 to 34, the majority. For the South Korean women, it was about 32 up to about 37. And the New Zealand women were on average around 40. So I do think that age was also a significant factor, but it definitely wasn't the only factor.
Why do you think it was older in the women from New Zealand on average?
I didn't select age for the study. It's just the participants who decided to take the study just happened to fall into a slightly older age category, but it was nothing that was under my control. I don't know why that differed. Looking back at that, I don't know if it would have made a difference, if I had restricted the age so that everyone was within, kind of the same decade. But part of the balance, as you all know, with the study is you want to make sure to be able to get enough people participating in the study. It did show up as significant, but it certainly wasn't the only significant factor. There are many other things I'd like to explore. One of the issues that, I had with the questionnaire is limiting the amount of time it takes for someone to complete it. And of course, the questionnaires were all translated into the participants' native languages. There's only so much you can ask before you start to have a dropout rate of people participating. There are many other questions I would love to have asked and couldn't. They'll be done in follow-up studies.
What sort of questions do you want to ask in the future studies?
I'd like to look at the more rural areas. I want to go a little bit more in depth around running businesses on the mobile applications. One of the questions I asked them was around perceived security and whether they found that to be an issue. It was not a significant issue. That really surprised me. I would have thought it would be, but the more I started to think about it, here in the U.S., we're constantly hearing about security issues. And in fact, we do have quite a trouble with, hacking in. And I wonder if it's because hacking into accounts and identity theft are not as much of an issue in these other countries. Security does not come as being an important factor at this point, and that maybe in the future it would be. I was interested, as I said, about starting businesses, about their views around security and privacy, and a little more around the interaction of the genders. It showed that they didn't perceive barriers, according to their culture, but I would like to explore that a little more. I wonder if I just didn't ask enough questions or I didn't ask the right questions around that. It's somewhat surprising to me that I wasn't picking up large cultural differences around that.
Well, amongst the girls who actually had an education and could actually read and write.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why there's the need to go into really the more rural areas to explore how this could be used, especially when you start to get into areas where there isn't literacy.
Hey, Deirdre, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, because it sounds like you're tapping into it, the ease of adoption. So were there certain attributes that you could tell of the technology that stood out that made it easier for the women to adopt?
I didn't show them particular applications or ask about particular features around the applications. That's another area of study that can be looked at, and one that I am interested in. I did ask a more general question about whether they perceived business applications to be difficult to learn or to use, that they're more complicated. And in my preliminary study to this, I asked them about the menus and the layout of the applications, but it wasn't showing up to be significant. So it didn't seem to be a barrier to them of the business apps versus the other applications. Of course, when we started to get a population that can't read or write, it's a whole other question of how you actually present the choices and the information so that they can effectively use it. There are applications that have successfully employed it through ICON. There's one study that I saw referenced. The person referenced the study but didn't cite it, so I'm still trying to track it. They said that they found that even women who could not read or write still were able to text on their phone.
Nice. Okay.
And I thought, that's really interesting. So what is it that they actually are texting? I'm still trying to hunt that study down.
Deirdre, do you think the questions that you were concerned that they didn't answer or answered in a way that you didn't expect, do you think possibly it's that it might not be culturally appropriate for them to respond to those kinds of questions?
I know that can definitely be an issue in some studies, especially within this reasoned action approach, which is most often used for health studies or abuse, drug abuse or alcohol abuse. And that can be a factor that they don't want to be negatively perceived. I didn't get from any of the questions the sense of that, because people were answering individually and it was known that it was completely anonymous and there's no tracking. So I didn't think they'd have the same intimidation that they might if I had been doing qualitative interviews. I do think that in combination with this study, a qualitative follow-up would be very interesting to be able to take some of these points and explore them in more depth with some representative populations.
I agree. And you know what I would love for you to talk about, because it was a terminology that I learned from your study, and that's about phablets. And I believe it was the Indonesian group, right? I think others might find it interesting. Okay, the South Korean. I think some people might find that interesting.
Okay. They have, as I mentioned, South Korea is considered number one in the world around internet connection, ICT, the communication technology. And so when I was doing this study on mobile, as I was researching, analyzing the results, I read something about South Korea, which it just had not to occur to me. They're the number one user in the world of phablets, which are the tablets, like the iPad, that have a phone built in. And so it hadn't occurred to me when I originally designed the study, they could be using that for their mobile technology and access and not necessarily answer my questions to include that they were just answering about their mobile phones. And so I wasn't sure if that would have an impact on the responses from South Korea, but they're very big into phablets there. It just shows you that sometimes there can be factors that you just don't take into account ahead of time, and then you have to look at it, and it just forms other questions that can be the next investigation.
Really interesting. Do we have some other questions for Deirdre, or just discussion topics in general?
I'm curious, are there any phablets in the United States? Are they available?
Isn't that basically what those large iPhones are now, or a small iPad mini?
I think, yeah, I have the Note 3, the Samsung, and then certainly the new iPhone 6 is approaching that because they're so much larger. But these phablets are actually more like an iPad size with the phone built in.
Okay.
That's my understanding. And no, I don't believe anyone has it here yet.
Be the wave of the future.
Yes. Yes. For so much of our history, kind of the quote unquote developed countries have gone through all of the stages of technology and development. And because of lack of resources or whatever political history, there are countries, who lag and then kind of follow the same steps, but at a later time. And what was so interesting is the development of mobile broadband allowed so many of the developing countries to just leapfrog the entire broadband stage of of wiring and cables and all of that and go immediately to mobile. And there are areas where there basically is no internet penetration at all, 10-12%, but people with phones that have texting, not smartphones. In Africa, you can see percentages up in the 80s. People do have access to that phone, and in the future, hopefully, to the internet on that phone once prices come down and access. But I think
you don't need an internet to text?
it's not an internet technology, the texting.
Can use the phone lines to do it, but also that you can do it over the internet.
Oh, okay.
Right, but these phones, yes, don't have internet, so they only have the SMS, the messaging, text messaging. Women in Pakistan and how they're using the text messaging to communicate with each other in the most rural communities and ones where there is a high rate of illiteracy. Women do have the phones and they are using them. It's a very interesting area.
Yeah.
So they text icons since they can't read or write?
They text numbers, and the numbers are assigned meaning. For this particular application, it's been designed to report abuse and different types of abuse. And so they type in numbers that correspond to whatever they're experiencing.
Very creative.
Yes.
Excellent, Deirdre. Does anybody else have anything they want to share?
Do you find that for women in the most conservative Islamic countries that there's less and less penetration into the market? And that would, for a country like Indonesia, which is amongst the most moderate Islamic countries in the world, it's higher because the religious form is more moderate?
That would be a supposition of mine, but it's not something that I included as part of the study. Other studies that have looked at just general aspects of technology and other parts of the Middle East, as you look at countries that are a little more relaxed than the others, you do tend to see more technology use by women. Yes. So I do think that there is a correlation.
Who funded your research?
I did.
Good for you.
She did an amazing job. So that's why for the future studies, she's looking for finance for that.
I would love to include, as I said, qualitative studies and additional countries and look at that. So as you're suggesting, if you're within the Islamic culture and it tends to be more strictly interpreted, do you see that there is a correlation? That, would be a really interesting study. But culture definitely has to, is significant for sure, because you'll see that, as I showed you on the Schwartz mapping of shared cultural values, where, Japan and U.S. were independent and Latin America was grouped and Islamic countries were grouped. The fact that even though they may be more than one country, their shared values based on culture are so close that they just map together across this whole series of questions around beliefs shows you that has to be significant. And when you look then at adoption, you'll see within the Americas, North America, and Central America, Mexico, the number of men and women using technology is equal. In fact, there are some places in South America where women exceed men.
Really? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's probably no barrier at all to their having a phone. There's certainly no cultural barrier, and they're using it more for communication. One of the things that when they first looked at how women are using the technology, internet in general, men were using it for entertainment and for gaming. This is globally. Yeah, and women are using it for communication, keeping in touch with families, posting photos. And so that's why when I started to look at the mobile for development, where they're now asking women to use it for businesses, to use it to register land, to use it to get government services, participate in government bidding, it's a real switch for the way that women have been using the technology in the past. Part of the interest I had was around how difficult will it be for them to make that switch and actually use it for business. Women have certainly started to use it more around education than they have before. And that's a huge factor for development as well, getting women education.
Did you have any trouble, especially with the Indonesian government, getting them to allow your study?
No, I actually used an in-country provider that was able to facilitate this. If they had to do anything on that end, they handled it. I didn't have any trouble with the countries. The most difficult part, of course, was the translation and then the verification of the translation.
Were your providers women?
Yes, they did the recruitment for me, and they followed very strict guidelines around completely anonymous surveys and not even tracking the IP. So there was no way to track. So, I mean, for any continuing study, I can't go back and ask these same people. You know, I could get similar populations. So that's what I meant when I answered that question before, that I don't think there might have been a reticence to answer the questions. I do think that they understood that there was a complete anonymity to their responses.
Did your in-country people have any ideas as to why, say, the population in New Zealand was closer to 40 on average, and yet the population in the youngest country was more like 24?
No.
Do you have any thoughts about why that was so different?
To be honest, I didn't go back to them to see why they could. If they could guess at that, I'm not sure. I just didn't put a limit on it with them. Maybe I should have. However, when I did look at kind of the range of the ages of all the people that answered, all three countries had a pretty wide bell curve. Now, they did all have to be 18 or older to participate in the study. From there on, they all did have a wide range. It's just that the apex of the curve just tended to center differently. I had people in their 50s and 60s. I think I even had someone in their 70s, a couple, answer. So there was a range. It's just that it's tended to concentrate among different age groups. The Indonesian and the South Korean were really pretty close together, and yet I saw significant differences in those populations.
That's a very interesting study.
Well, thank you
for doing it.
Thank you very much for your questions.
Well, thank you, Deirdre. Thank you for being the number 2 webinar series in the Society for Media Psychology and Technology, American Psychological Association. We're really excited to be able to offer this great information, fascinating. I'm sure there'll be a lot of future discussions on the listserv and elsewhere about this topic. I will be posting a link to the listserv of the recording so that we can continue this discussion, but really quite an honor to have you here with us today, and fascinating study. And for those of you who are listening, if you have a topic that you'd like to present or like to get involved with the series, please feel free to contact me, Dr. Jerry Lynn Hogg, and I'm the president this year, 2015. My email address is hoggjl, HOGGJL, @AOL.com. And I can also point you in the direction of Dr. Deirdre Bradley if you're interested in following up with some direct conversations with her. So thank you again, Deirdre. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was an honor to be asked.